Okay, so we're looking at the human impacts on the Great Barrier Reef, which is just off the coast of Queensland, and it is the world's largest natural reef system, and it's also one of the most beautiful. However, it is being greatly impacted by a number of human influences that are having detrimental effects on the reef. Okay, so from 1985 to 2012, human influences have resulted in a 50% decline in coral cover on the reefs. And so this is due to a number of different things that we'll have a look at now. So first of these is agriculture runoff. So farm pollution is one of the key drivers of the reef's decline, as it smothers the corals and seagrass beds and denies them sunlight and stops them from performing photosynthesis, which kills off some of the coral polyps. And you can see some dead coral polyps, a comparison with that as the picture on the screen. Additionally, it also drives crown of thorns starfish outbreaks and makes coral more vulnerable to bleaching. So the nitrogen runoff from farms, you can see an example of that in the picture there. You can see all the sediment that's draining out of the rivers into the reef. Leads to algae blooms and So currently about 80% of the land along the coast of the reef is used for cattle grazing and crop growing. Various pesticides, chemicals and fertilisers are used on these crops, and also there's the waste produced by the farm animals. These pollutants enter streams in the river through surface runoff or soil infiltration. These then enter into the ocean, into the reef ecosystems, and these chemicals and pesticides are poisonous and can kill various life forms on the reef. As these fertilisers and animal waste are high in phosphorus and nitrogen, like we talked about before, they are deadly to coral polyps. So the reef receives runoff from 35 major catchments that drain 424,000 square kilometres of coastal Queensland, and most of this sediment entering the Great Barrier Reef comes from catchments in major pastoral areas such as Herbert and the Fitzroy rivers. So another human impact on the reef is that of industrialisation and mining. So there are currently plans to expand several ports along the Great Barrier Reef coastline. This port expansion leads to dredging of the seafloor, increased shipping traffic, and a range of other impacts on this delicate coastal environment. Currently, about 80% of the material dumped at sea is dredged material. So in terms of mining, historically, extensive small-scale mining operations have occurred throughout much of the Great Barrier Reef catchment, and production of saleable coal in Queensland has more than doubled since the early 1990s, and the region is now associated with some of the world's largest mines and coal ports. There is a proposed 21.7 billion Adani coal mine on Queensland coast. This has raised some serious issues for environmentalists, concerned by the detrimental effects that the dredging and associated runoff and sedimentation of this mine could potentially have on the reef ecosystem. Another human impact is that of overfishing, and this leads to a decline in fish populations and has ecosystem-wide impacts, and also impacts on dependent human communities. So some examples of destructive fishing methods include the use of explosions to kill or stun fish, which destroys the corals. So you can see a infographic / flowchart sort of thing on the screen. It's got some more helpful information there. Another human impact is pollution, and it's estimated about 7 billion tonnes of lead is put into the oceans every year. Over half of this is various forms of plastic. So these have detrimental effects on the wildlife, and for example, every year about 1 million seabirds around the world die as a result of plastics. We also have the threat posed by introduced species. So these are species that have been transported by humans, generally on ships from other regions of the world, including to the Great Barrier Reef. It's estimated that over 250 different species have been introduced into Australia and the Great Barrier Reef from various parts of the world. According to the research by the Australian According to the research by the Australian Institute of Marine Science, coral cover on the surveyed reefs has declined by about 50%, and crown of thorns starfish are responsible for about half of this decline, so they are a significant issue when it comes to introduced species and the overall health of the reef. So tourism is another impact. So this is an unintentional contributor to the general decline of the reef. So leisure vehicles heading out for tours of the reef, and also reef-based activities such as reef walking, using submersibles, and even the runoff from various sunscreens are all contributing negative factors that, when combined with the sheer volume of tourists who frequent the reef, are much more harmful than they may seem. But perhaps the most widely talked about and obvious impact is that of climate change. So there's a quote from David Attenborough on the screen, Sir David Attenborough, which says that the Great Barrier Reef is in grave danger. The twin perils brought by climate change, an increase in the temperature of the ocean and its acidity, threaten its very existence. So rising sea temperature leads to a greater risk of heat stress and mass coral bleaching. Since 1910 to 1929, average ocean temperatures around Australia have warmed by 0.68 degrees Celsius. The records set in the summer of 2012 to 13 were the hottest sea surface temperatures that have been ever recorded in the Australian region. This climate change also leads to increased frequency of severe weather events, including more intense cyclones, which destroy and weaken the reef structure. Ocean acidification is another impact of climate change. And so since the 18th century, the oceans have absorbed about 30% of the additional carbon dioxide that human activities have injected into the atmosphere. This extra CO2 in the oceans have changed their chemistry, and this is also known as ocean acidification, with the pH of oceans decreasing. This is estimated to have caused a decrease in oceanic pH of 0.1%. The last impact that climate change will have on the reef is that of rising sea levels. This is significant because most of the Great Barrier Reef is actually low-lying, and predictions of a future increase in sea levels range from 0.6 metres across the Great Barrier Reef region. These will also mean land inundation, which will cause significant changes in the tidal habitats, in tidal habitats such as mangroves and saltwater intrusion into low-lying freshwater habitats. However, amongst all these negative impacts, humans have actually had some somewhat positive impacts on the reef. And so one of these is in the form of tourism, which can be beneficial. It promotes public environmental awareness and spreads education about reef ecosystems. It also implies employment opportunities and a source of income for businesses. The government generates revenue through taxes and licensing, and much of this money generated from tourism is actually used to help protect the reef through environmental management programs, monitoring the status of the reef, and enforcing laws in zoning areas. And so nearly all of the money generated from daily visitor park fees is used to manage the marine park. And so this increased number of tourists can result in improved environmental planning and development. So there's been a number of legislation and reef zoning that has taken place, including the Great Barrier Reef being named a World Heritage Site in 1981, and various conservation protections placed on the reef by both the local and federal government. There's a little graph there that talks about the different zones in the reef and how that's changed over time. So primarily the positive human impacts revolve around protection and conservation of the reef. This also encompasses scientific research and development that has been undertaken that will help the reef to adapt and survive in these human-induced changes, most specifically climate change. So yeah, has been some positive impacts, but these are primarily to counteract the negative human impacts that we've put on this beautiful reef ecosystem.